Welcome everybody to another video made exclusively for YouTube. In this video I will be doing something that most streamers do very often, and in general most chess enthusiasts and you among them are probably familiar with, which is the Puzzle Rush feature on chess.com. Now Puzzle Rush is a type of tactics trainer that basically took the world by storm when it was released, I would say approximately a year ago. And the concept behind Puzzle Rush is very simple. You get a certain amount of time to solve as many problems as you can. You have 3 strikes, and the problems increase in difficulty. Now, as Puzzle Rush got older, chess.com came out with a new feature called Puzzle Rush Survival, which essentially gives you unlimited time. The puzzles still get tougher and tougher with each one you solve correctly. And once again, 3 strikes means that the run is over. And while it might seem that one could get an infinite score, the problems at some point get so incredibly hard that even with, hours and hours spent, it still is very difficult to solve them. So a lot of streamers, a lot of grandmasters do Puzzle Rush on stream. And while it can be impressive to watch them solve problems very, very quickly, the instructive value of their run is, I would say, at best very limited, because most people are simply not following what's going on the board, and they are not explaining how it is that they're finding the things that they're finding. So let me give you an example. If I were to do a 3-minute Puzzle Rush run, and I wasn't trying to be instructive, this is what it would look like. As you can see, I'm about to solve some problems very, very quickly, and I'm not going to do an entire run here, but you can see that I am simply going for speed here. I mouse slipped, and etc., etc. So I will not do this. Let me get 3 wrong so I can restart. I'm going to go back into Puzzle Rush here. What I'm going to do in this video is actually walk through the puzzles very slowly and explain exactly how I solve each puzzle. So I'm going to do survival mode up until 40 puzzles are solved, and then I will make a separate video about the tougher puzzles, which generally start at approximately puzzle number 40. So I'll spread that into 2 videos, and in this video I'm going to go through every single puzzle. I'm going to explain exactly what I see, and in general I'm going to try to provide sort of a high-level guide for tactical problem solving. So without further ado, let's get started. Now the first couple of problems are generally very easy, and they usually feature either a quick checkmate or capturing a piece or something like that. So when I look at this position, I immediately see that Black's king is hemmed in by his own pawns. That's a weak back rank. Nothing is defending that back rank, so we can give a check, and we can take the rook with checkmate. Now the second problem, what I immediately see is this pawn on b2. When you have a fianchettoed bishop, you have to see everything that bishop pressures, even through an x-ray. And this knight on f6 can easily be gotten out of the way, and what's going to happen then is that Black is going to have 2 attackers on that b2 square, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the knight, and then I'm going to take the b2 pawn. Here, I'm simply going to count the attackers on the e8 rook. We have 1 attacker and 2 attackers. Now notice that the rook on e1 is still an attacker through the x-ray. Now the concept of an x-ray is very, very important, and it allows us to understand that even though the queen is the only piece that's currently making direct contact with the rook on e1 is still indirectly pressuring that square, because after we take, the rook is in fact going to be defending that square. Takes, rook takes e8, and we're up a rook. Now this is an endgame, but that doesn't mean there are no tactics. In fact, endgame tactics. I actually made a video on that. Now here we see the king on g3 being incredibly active. The king on g1 is completely hemmed in. We have rooks doubled on the f file, which means that rook f1 is going to be checkmate, because this rook on f8 is guarding that square. And as we just discussed, the king has nowhere to go. So we're going to go ahead and deliver that checkmate. Here, the first thing we often have to do in these types of middle game positions is check for hanging pieces. And there's no rocket science behind this. I just look across the board, I scan the board, and I notice any and all pieces or pawns that are hanging. Now, Black's queen is hanging, which means he has to move it. But you'll also notice that the e3 pawn is hanging, and that's actually going to be a fork, which means that not only do we win a pawn, we also win a knight. Now, this position is very interesting because we're currently pinned. So, this knight on e5 might seem like it's toast. If we defend it with a move like f6, well, white could get his bishop out and pressure the knight even further, so it doesn't seem like we gain anything from that. But loose pieces drop off is one of my favorite acronyms and one of my favorite abbreviations that helps us see a lot of tactics. The rook on e1 is undefended. That is why it's so important to connect to rooks. And because it's undefended, it is prone to discover checks. What can we do? We can give a check with the knight, exposing the queen's attack on the rook. So we actually, the hunted becomes the hunter, and the queen takes e1. Now it's clear immediately from this problem that both kings are in grave danger, which means most probably we need to operate with checks. The first check that I see is queen e1 check. He has to block with a bishop. And while we can't take the bishop in that position because the king is defending, what we can do is ward off the king by giving another preliminary check on d2. The king has to go back to b1, and then queen takes d1 is, of course, checkmate. Another double rook endgame faces us next. Now, first thing I notice is the b2 pawn. This is a huge asset for black, but we have to act very, very fast because given an opportunity, white's going to go rook a4, rook a2, and he's going to surround and take that pawn, and black's never going to win. So what I'm seeing is that we would really love to get a rook on a1, and it has to be this rook, because if we go rook a8, we relinquish our control over the b2 pawn. So we go rook a5. Okay, he gives a check on d8, but now we take the rook and we're up a rook. This one is a classic application of LPDO. First thing I noticed, knight on c6 is loose. The king on g8 is a little bit airy because he's played f6, so there are some weaknesses here, which means that we have a very typical fork against the king and the knight. Boom, problem solved. Loose pieces drop off, one of the most important tactical abbreviations that you have to apply in most positions. Okay. Now here I immediately notice the king, and it's also clear to me that because white is down a piece, he's got to do something essentially immediately. And if he takes the bishop, then black takes the rook and its mate. So I notice that while I cannot give a check on c8, that square is covered, what I can do is give a preliminary check on c7, forcing the king to the back rank, and then I go queen c8 with a mate. Check, sacrificing the queen there. Once again, notice the x-ray that the rook is exerting on the c8 square. Check, checkmate. Now here it's very important to avoid instinct, right? The instinct is to take on c8, but take a look at the whole board. What do you see? What I see is the queen-bishop battery here, which is a very fearsome battery. It's looking right at the h2 square. The h2 square is undefended, which means this is checkmate. Okay. Now, this may look like an intimidating position, but really it's not, because look at white's king. White's king has no squares. The rook on g2 is very nicely defended by the pawn on f3. Now, is black threatening anything? Yes, he is. He is threatening to capture on h3 and deliver checkmate. Okay, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that we're in check. And all that we have to do is find the fastest way to escape the checks. And the fastest way to escape the check, is it on the 7th rank? No, he's got another check. It's on the 5th rank. If we go to f5, he has no knight checks. And the rook check to b5 simply meets with a takes b5. He goes knight h7. That doesn't actually help white's cause. We simply take the knight, and there's no stopping. Okay. Big deal. Another check. We take it, and we win. Again, this problem, very important to avoid knee-jerk reaction. A knee-jerk reaction is to recapture the rook. But guess what? Loose pieces drop off, and I also notice the contact that the queens are making through the knight, which means we need to be thinking about discover checks. Guess what? Is there a discover check with the knight? There sure is. Knight g3 check and free queen. Okay, so white is down in exchange, but what I immediately notice is that when there's rooks and I wanted to say kings, but as far as I know, black has only one king. When there's two rooks and a king clustered together like this, and there's a centralized knight, that means you need to be looking for forks. Now, if we fork him immediately, it's important to notice that he's actually just going to take our rook, and at the end of the day, he's actually going to trap the knight as well. So what we want to do is we want to first take the rook. That brings the king and the rook into a vulnerable situation where we can now fork them and pick off the rook with a winning pawn endgame. Now, these problems are always tricky for people because there seem to be no overt tactics available to white. And yet, in fact, there are. And the specific tactic is this concerns this queen on e5. I immediately see that it's out of squares. This move rook f6, it has actually taken away the queen's escape route back to black's camp. The queen has no other squares, so all we need to do is find a way to attack the queen. Well, we can do that with both rooks. We can do rook ae1 or rook fe1, but rook fe1 relinquishes control over the f4 square. So instead we go rook ae1 and we take the queen. Okay. Now this one is actually very tricky. And guess what? Loose pieces drop off. Rook on c1 is loose. Now, I don't know if this tactic is actually going to exploit the rook, but what I want to make very, very clear is that when you're solving problems, or in general when you're playing, you want to spend a large amount of time just observing, just noticing things about the position, whether or not you're actually going to end up exploiting them. That's a different story, but you're not going to find stuff without actually first observing. Much like in the scientific method, you need to collect observations first, before you hypothesize about the data. So we look at the rook on c1, it's weak. Is there anything else vulnerable in black's position? Well, the king sure is, right? Because there's no defender surrounding the king. So, as many teach us, we need to start by looking at checks, captures, and threats. Now, the capture is just absurd because the bishop is defended. There is a check on e8, and that forces the king out either onto g7 or h7. But then combining that with our first observation about the rook, you might notice that we have this move, queen to b2, swinging the queen onto a beautiful square where it is A, attacking the rook, and B, threatening checkmate on h8. So it's actually a kind of fork. Now he goes to g7, which makes this even more obvious because it's just a check, and we pick off the rook. Now, here we see that there is just a mass of pieces clustered on the king's side, and we need to make something of that. Now, the first observation I'm making is that if the rook on h4 were gone, apologies, my voice seems to be cracking just as I start recording this video. Now, if the rook were gone, we would have the possibility of delivering a check on h2 with the queen. Unfortunately, as far as I know, the queen can't jump over the rook. But we need to figure out if perhaps we might be able to sacrifice the rook in order to pave the way for the queen, and we can do just that. We can give a check on h1, forcing the knight back, and then we go queen h2 check with absolutely devastating effect. Take the knight, and the problem's been solved. Now, this is one of those problems where, it's important not to get intimidated by the abundance of pieces that white has. He's got two queens, he's got a rook, but look at how many pieces black has on the king's side. We have a simple checkmate. g2, knight's covering this square, queen's defending the pawn. Bingo. This is one of those where you have to look at the whole board. If we look at the whole board, we will see that black simply has a hanging piece. And a lot of puzzle rush problems they get you on your preconception that it's going to be tricky. But sometimes the problem is actually very, very simple, as it is here. Bishop is hanging. We're just going to take it. And we have one more hurdle to cross. Black attacks the knight. Now, the knight can't move just anywhere because this rook is going to be lost. So the knight has to move to a square where it simultaneously guards the rook. Is there such a square? There absolutely is. Next problem. I immediately see the tension between the two bishops. And I also see the fact that the king is still in the center. Whenever the king is in the center, it is particularly vulnerable to various kinds of checks. And combining those two observations, we see that there is a very typical fork on the bishop. Boom, 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 and we're up a piece. Well, guess what? This is exactly the same problem. And you know what? I'm going to amend this video. I'm actually going to do 25 problems in this video, and then 25 problems in the next, etc. Because I think that's just a better distribution of time. This is, I want things to be in bite-sized pieces. So we're going to end at 25. Also, my voice seems to be going. Now we see the bishop on b5 undefended. We see the king on e1 centralized, which means that combining the two together, same exact idea. Now there's one more hurdle. We can't take the knight immediately. Sorry, we can't take the bishop immediately because the knight is guarding it. But this is where our fianchettoed bishop comes in. We take the knight, and then we take the bishop. So what do I see here? Well, we got to look at white's heavy pieces, right? In any position, we start by just looking at how our opponent's pieces are positioned and whether we can exploit any kind of latent weaknesses there. Now, we see that the queen on d3 is vulnerable to an attack by the bishop, right? It's on a light square. We have a light scored bishop. Therefore, we go bishop a6. Now, this mess might seem intimidating, but it's not. And what we have to do is just unpack the situation for a second. He's attacking our queen. We're attacking his queen. And according to sort of the golden rule, we have to start by looking at the captures first. So if we take the queen and he takes our queen, if we take the knight, he's going to take our bishop, but our bishop is also attacking his rook. So we can actually just take his rook and then take the knight, and we're just going to be up a rook. Boom. Okay. Interesting situation that we have here. Now, first thing to notice is white is down a piece, but he's clearly attacking black's king. by our rule, checks, captures, and threats. There's only one capture, rook takes e5. It's not particularly good. Checks, well, there's definitely going to be checks with a vulnerable king like this, and there's a check on g5. And when the king moves, I notice that queen on g5 is actually, can combine with a rook to take on e5. And what's going to happen then is this bishop on c5, notice, undefended, is actually going to be skewered by the queen and the rook, in addition to white having a devastating attack. He just takes on e5, so we're going to take back. Okay, things get a little bit trickier. I notice the tension between the queens. Now, if I take the queen, he's just going to take back, and we haven't gained anything. We can win a pawn, but generally, as a hint, in Puzzle Rush problems, the solution always entails winning at least 2 pawns, and usually at least a piece, which is the absolute bare minimum in most problems. A lot of the time, it's either checkmate or it's an overwhelming amount of material. So we have that in our back pocket, but we also have a light squared bishop, and the queen is on a light square. I notice immediately that the queen and the king are on the same diagonal. Noticing that the queen and the king are on the same diagonal immediately forces us to think about pins, right? Now, it appears that we cannot go bishop b5 because the a6 pawn can simply take the bishop, but combining that with our observation that the rook on a8 is undefended, which hopefully you've noticed by now, as I've hammered you over the head with this, we see that we, in fact, can play bishop b5. He takes with the queen, it's the same thing. We take the queen, and actually, not only do we win an exchange, we actually win the other rook as well. And so we win the game. Now, I see 2 things when I look at this problem. First of all, I see the back rank. The back rank is weak, which means the rook cannot leave the 8th rank, otherwise he's going to get checkmated. Second thing I notice is the tension that's going on between white's rook and black's rook, both of them looking at black's knight, which means that this rook is what's called overloaded. Now, as you can probably guess, if a piece is overloaded, it's doing too many things at once, which is something that I do very often in real life. The rook is both defending the knight and defending the king. So if we attack the rook, it is not going to be able to keep doing both at the same time. Is there a way to attack the rook? Absolutely. Now, one more hurdle to cross, because he's counterattacking our rook. If we take his rook, he takes ours, and we haven't gained anything. But what did I say about knights and kings in close proximity? That means forks. Knight e7 check doesn't work because he takes with the knight, but we first take on d5. Now the knight and the rook, the king and the rook are forkable. Boom. Let's do one more. First thing I see, the pawns. Now, black is down a piece, which probably means we need to operate quickly. The first move we need to look at is a2 check. Now, a2 check forces the king to move. If it moves to a1, it's clear that we have a check on c2 followed by promotion. If he moves to b2, well, then we still have knight c2. The knight supports the passed pawn. He cannot stop promotion because white's pawn is simply too far away. This is a simple exercise in, once again, starting by looking at checks. Check here. Now, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. We are going to lose this knight, but we're going to make a new queen. And we, ladies and gentlemen, are going to pause here. These were the first 25 problems of Puzzle Rush Survival. Of course, these were the easier problems. In tomorrow's video, first of all, hopefully my voice will be back, and my apologies for the hoarseness. But tomorrow we will solve the next 25 problems, and on we will go until I hit 3 strikes. I hope that, by going slowly, I've succeeded in breaking down some of the things that I see, some of the ways that I solve these problems, and hopefully I've armed you with a couple of tips that you can use to at least cross the first 25 problems in Puzzle Rush. Tactify on. Go solve some problems. Hope you enjoyed the video, and feel free, as usual, to leave comments and constructive criticism in the comments below. Now, we'll see you guys in the next video where we will do the next 25 problems. Thank you.